What up, Coordination? On the pod today, we have Shrey from Microsoft Research. He is an applied scientist there, and we are talking about common knowledge. So basically, common knowledge is when you know something and I know that you know it, and everyone else in our community knows that you know it. And I think the most famous example in the Web3 space of common knowledge is blockchains. So the Byzantine generals problem, which is at the foundation of how Bitcoin creates consensus of the common knowledge of what is the state of the ledger, is probably the most famous example of common knowledge being a game-changing thing in the Web3 ecosystem. But it's also an important thing in supply chains, bank settlements, civic trust, defense, public goods funding. What's the point of having a perfect public goods funding mechanism if you don't have common knowledge in your community about which public goods are good in that community? So Shrey is just a giga brain. This is one of those just very lucid, intellectually rich episodes in which we are talking about something that's game theoretically really important. And because it's game theoretically really important, I think it's a high leverage point. So basically, on this podcast, you'll see us talking about things like collective intelligence, super modularity, common knowledge, these things that are game theoretically important for creating coordination, for creating a coordination. We'll always be seeking out the highest leverage point. So I think common knowledge is a tool in the tool belt as we think about creating more coordination and solving coordination failures, which is the cornerstone of creating a regenerative crypto economics movement in my view. So really fun episode with Shrey. Without further ado, let's get into it. Enjoy.
Working in Web3 is awesome, but working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best: their work. Tax time is coming up. OPOLIS helps professionalize your business by helping you form an entity, generate proof of employment through pay stubs, and receive a W-2 at the end of the tax year. Are you self-employed and forced to spend money on expensive healthcare insurance with limited coverage? OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. And finally, OPOLIS's member owners share in OPOLIS's success and profits based on their work token holdings. You must be authorized to work inside the United States and select Canadian provinces to receive OPOLIS's benefits. Book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS's experts and join OPOLIS by March 31st, 2023 to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. And if you're going to ETH Denver, make sure to stop by the OPOLIS booth or attend their Future of Work Summit hosted by OPOLIS. The Glow dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As the market cap of Glow goes up, extreme poverty goes down. Glow is a dollar-backed, non-profit stablecoin that creates basic income for people living in extreme poverty. Glow is basically the same business model as USDC, with yield-generating treasuries on one side and a stablecoin on Ethereum on the other. But instead of being a for-profit company, Glow is a non-profit that donates 100% of all yields from the Glow Reserve to Give Directly's basic income program. Give Directly is a charity that gives people money, no strings attached, to people living in poverty, and is a charity that Vitalik has previously donated to and supported in the past. With Glow, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. Glow is launching in early 2023, and you can join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/greenpill. That's glodollar.org/greenpill.
All right. What's up, Shrey?
Hey, Kevin. How's it going?
Not too bad. I've been looking forward to this episode for a while, so I'm really excited to dive in on common knowledge. So let's build some common knowledge. What is common knowledge?
Yeah, exactly. So common knowledge is this concept that is from in many different fields of academia, both economics, psychology, and computer science. And it's this concept of representing the knowledge that people have in a given setting. And so the formal definition of common knowledge is a proposition is said to be common knowledge if everyone knows that this proposition is true. Everyone knows that everyone knows that this proposition is true. And everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows that this proposition is true, which is a very confusing and very academic way of defining common knowledge. And I think for the computer science listeners listening to this podcast, maybe the canonical problem of the Byzantine generals problem may feel much more, will ground this concept a bit easier. And so if you're familiar with the Byzantine generals problem, it's this problem where you have two generals who are on either side of a mountain that want to attack, and they can't communicate with one another without a messenger. And this messenger has the capabilities of being lost. And so you can never with 100% guarantee ensure that your message was delivered. And so what happens is for a given general who sends a message, they say, let's attack at 6 p.m. And so for that general, they sent the message. The question to the audience is, do these two generals attack at 6 p.m.? The answer is no, because the other general, the general who sent the message doesn't know that the other general received the message. Let's say now that other general acknowledges the sent message and they say, I got your message, let's attack at 6 p.m. Do they attack? Well, no, because the receiving general doesn't know that the initial sender general got the acknowledgement. And this happens for infinite amount of time. And in theory, they never attack. And so common knowledge.
I would just interject, like, sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say that, like, my understanding of the Byzantine general's problem is that a coordinated attack leads to victory and an uncoordinated attack leads to defeat. So, like, this common knowledge of, are we going to attack at dawn, is literally life or death in this game theoretic scenario.
Yeah, and it's this game theoretic scenario that it's not too unreasonable to extrapolate to the real world. When you think about protesters in specific settings, if one protester goes alone in front of an area under which they could be killed if they go alone, but could potentially take down a empire who's potentially putting all the citizens subject to pain. If they go in thousands of people, they could potentially take them down. But with one person, they get killed potentially. And so it's under these specific scenarios, having common knowledge is almost a necessary requirement for successful coordination outcomes. And we see this at various different degrees, the extreme forms we're talking about here, but even more subtle forms, whether it's supply chain management, how we're coordinating to sign a contract, or how we're coordinating to take action in any given outcome today where communication is involved.
Right. Well, I mean, a couple of points on this. So the Byzantine general's problem, as I understand it, is solving it is the core innovation behind proof of work and Bitcoin, and what allows us to have decentralized ledgers today. Is that right?
That's right. And I think there's this really great paper by Joe Halpern and Raphael Passer, two professors from Cornell, that have a knowledge-based analysis of the blockchain protocol. And they walk through why blockchains are uniquely suited to facilitate common knowledge. And they walk through this like very elegant proof as to why that is. But in general, these concepts are precisely what you said. It's these consensus building mechanisms and the way that data is appended to the blockchain network that allows us to achieve close to common knowledge, what's known as common P belief. Because we can never achieve exact common knowledge if we can ever have a message fail. And so that's why we call that term common P belief.
Okay, so the difference between common knowledge and common key belief is what? Can you just say it one more time?
Yeah, common P belief is a probabilistic estimate. So with probability P, we have common knowledge basically of this proposition being true. And with probability P, everyone knows that this proposition is true. And with probability P, everyone knows that this proposition is true. Because we can never have 100% probability in any given digital communication setting as of right now, at least.
So this is really interesting for me. As most listeners know, I was involved in Gitcoin early in my Web3 journey, which was all about funding public goods, things like open source software, which create billions of dollars in economic value, but there is no business model for them. And so how do you fund public goods in the Web3 space is like the ultimate sort of coordination failure that I think that we've been aiming for. And, we've been talking a lot on this podcast and just in the Gitcoiniverse about quadratic funding, which is this mechanism for routing capital to people. And I think that the mechanism is interesting because it routes capital, it pushes power to the edges and allocates capital to what's broadly popular among the populace as opposed to what the rich people like. But one thing that I think that we sort of miss in like crowing about public goods and retroactive public goods funding and quadratic funding is that common knowledge is the base of an ecosystem. Like if you have a perfect mechanism for distributing funding to public goods, but you don't have a base of common knowledge among the participants that is accurate and is nuanced about what is actually valuable in that ecosystem, the mechanism doesn't matter. So like common knowledge feels like it's at the base of a lot of coordination failures that we could solve in Web3.
Precisely, yeah. And I think that common knowledge is it's a core to coordination outcomes. And we've seen some really interesting empirical research studies to show that like if a set of participants have common knowledge, they're more likely to take risky tasks. And those outcomes pay much higher than a non-risky outcome generally. And so it's interesting to see the impacts that common knowledge can have, yet we don't index on achieving this level of knowledge, maybe because it's so granular or it's a bit pedantic in many ways. But I think it's interesting to see how when using specific communication protocols, facilitating common knowledge can drastically impact the coordination outcomes. And we see that with many supply chains today is a very like practical use of this. And we're hoping to see its use in more like consensus building mechanisms, governance tooling, whether it be in DAOs or more traditional organizations, et cetera.
Yeah. One yes and that I'll add that I think is a little bit meta is that after I talked to you about common knowledge the first time, I tweeted out podcasts are just little pockets of common knowledge. So I think there's a meta loop here where we're creating common knowledge about common knowledge by doing this podcast together.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because even like, let's take an example of what's common knowledge amongst your specific communities. And you belong to many communities, whether that be Gitcoin, the GreenPilled podcast, and many others that I may be unaware of as well. It's the common knowledge that you and those listeners have that allow you to speak incredibly efficiently with one another. As an example, when you say like regen, if you were to feed regen to a typical AI like ChatGPT, it's reading regen with a very different meaning and context than what regen means to the set of listeners that you've established along with the communities that you're part of. And like, because that information is common knowledge, it allows you to communicate incredibly efficiently with those people. And maybe a more practical example of that could be the field of law or the field of medicine, where doctors who speak that same language, whether basically all encompassed in these textbooks, allow them to communicate with far more information basically per word than people who are outside of that context. And like, this is extending from information theory, Claude Shannon's source code theorem, which basically says that like, what is the minimal amount of information that we can basically pack it into a given number of ones and zeros? It's when people have common knowledge of a given set of words or terms or cultural traditions and whatever that may be, you're able to fit much more information per 1 and 0 in this analogy. And so it's like common knowledge is also very important from a perspective of efficient communication, not just coordination as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, this feels really applicable to a lot of things like, for me, the example that sort of jumps out is these filter bubbles that we're all in social media, where we're kind of talking to these echo chambers that have not only common knowledge with each other, but common beliefs with each other. The polarization in the United States is partially driven by cultural differences, but also the left and the right get just news from completely different places with each other. So it feels like if we're going to build social interop and break down polarization, then building a common base of common knowledge might be an important thing. I'm wondering, where else does common knowledge really matter in our modern information space?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I like to just prime the audience with this concept of what's called context collapse. Mm-hmm. Context collapse is this communication studies idea that talks about how our existing digital information structures, like when I say digital information structures, I'm referring to mostly social networks like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit. They have facilitated this form of posting and information sharing in a capacity that doesn't preserve context of where that information originated. And so as an example, if I post on Twitter something about our conversation we're having in this podcast, you might have the rich context about what it is that we talked about because of our prior conversation. But the audience of my Twitter followers, who's composed of both my professional colleagues, friends, family, along with people who I work out with or whoever that may be, may not have that context. And so when they interpret that information, it's mixing all these different fields of view into one. And so when they read that information, they interpret it in a much different way. And so our existing information structures, first of all, don't preserve context. And so we have very minimal boundaries on what it is that when we communicate. And two is that because of that, we are unable to determine what is and what is not common knowledge amongst a set of participants because there are no boundaries. Like the easiest way to determine what is and what is not common knowledge is to first identify who is in this group of people that we're trying to ensure has common knowledge about a given fact. And then two, what is that fact itself? But now we have this first problem of we don't know who it is interpreting that information and if they have the appropriate context to do so. And this problem is only going to be more exacerbated by the challenges that large language models or foundation models pose to our ability of information sharing online, where we're going to be flooded with information and we won't know what came from where. And this problem of provenance becomes much, much more challenging.
Yeah, it does seem like a real challenge. I mean, I guess like what's the information stack here? Like for me, it feels like I'm just visualizing in my mind that information is at the bottom of the stack, and then there's knowledge, and then there's wisdom, and truth is sort of somewhere around like knowledge or wisdom. Like, what's the taxonomy of information that you think about? Is it a vertical stack like that? That would just help me sort of visualize what we're doing here.
Maybe I would try to even frame a different stack, because I think that the one that you're framing is much harder, I think, for me mentally to frame. But I think one that makes more sense is maybe just thinking about how we share information in the physical world and then trying to map that to what it's now looking like in the digital world. And so, like, in the physical world, there's this concept that Twitter uses, at least, called the public square. And the public square is this like actually very rich historical concept where people actually came together in this public square to share information. And it was when you stood up on this platform in a public square and you started sharing things with this audience, you could visibly see each participant who was in this given room, and you could tell if they were listening to you. And so when you said something, you know that they were listening, and they knew that you were listening to them speaking. So you had common knowledge. You also had this boundary of who was inside of that room and who was outside of that room. And this is why physical communication is the most rich form of communication today, because we're able to preserve context and we're able to establish common knowledge, like perfect common knowledge. But when we try to map this now to the digital stack, what we have is we have these public squares and like quotation marks here, because we don't know who's sitting in this room. We don't know if they're actually listening, if they have the context to understand what it is that we're saying. And we don't have a boundary drawn on each of our given circles. And like group chats aren't even sufficient, right? Group chats are leaky. You can screenshot and share information today. Now that becomes an interesting problem in itself that we can talk about later. But that, I think, is the mapping that feels more right to me when it comes to how, like, what it is that we're talking about here is like, if we're trying to improve communication flows, our physical communication flows were actually some of the best, and the internet has actually degraded our ability to communicate, paradoxically. Like, the way we think about it is the internet has allowed us to communicate in this very broad form to basically anyone around the world with an internet connection, right? But this efficient communication and this communication in a way that is so broad and allows knowledge or information, whatever you want to call that, to be shared very quickly, has degraded our ability to preserve context and establish common knowledge, which has therefore really impacted our ability to communicate effectively.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have in our notes here, like, how did the internet break our ability to communicate? And I think that you just sort of went into that. Like, we've created the ability to communicate across these boundaries. And before, we were all in these little containers of common knowledge that were like our small towns and our cities. And we had these relationships where we could see each other, we could vibe with each other, and we could read whether or not we saw each other. And now we're all a part of these plurality of communities. You know, I'm a part of Rocket Pool Reddit. I'm a part of Gitcoin's Discord. I'm on crypto Twitter. And because we're so fractured in the communities that we're a part of, and not everyone who's in those communities is also in our communities, there's these like sort of, I don't want to say safe spaces, but just like containers for common knowledge anymore. And so we have the ability to communicate across all these boundaries, but not the ability to trust or to have common knowledge across all these boundaries. And that just creates a lot of challenges. Like, how else do you think the internet broke our ability to communicate and create common knowledge?
It's precisely that. It's the, like, now our ability to use these different rich words that have a lot of meaning to a given context, like cultural traditions or personal stories, national memories, or whatever these very rich context-specific spaces that we had established in the physical world, they mean much less in this digital space, because a lot of people lack the context to interpret what that information means. And so, I mean, even now you're seeing a lot of people migrating towards group chat based messaging as opposed to large information network messaging. Like, people, yes, use Twitter still very actively, but there's a large amount of people that I interact with, at least, who maybe is a bias for the types of people who are trying new types of social tools, but are moving towards actively using group chats much more than they are social platforms. And an example of this is, like, even Twitter has tried to solve this, right? They have the Twitter lists is one example. So you can create a list of different people who are in a specific, context, whether it's like economists, machine learning people, or whatever you may label these lists. They also have Twitter communities. So it's like groups of people on Twitter that post. But like, for some reason, they still feel insufficient. And so you're seeing more people moving towards Telegram chats, iMessage chats, whatever that may be, to preserve the context of communication. And like part of that is because when I communicate in that group chat, which is a very small space, there is a cost of me communicating. Like my reputation is at cost. Like in the Web3 world, you could think about how your wallet basically here being part of these small settings is now subject to being either like, maybe an aggressive word here is like shadow banned, but more importantly, like your reputation goes down and your ability to take your identity with you from one group chat to another becomes much harder. And so by communicating in these context-rich spaces, you're incentivized to communicate in a much more healthy way as well. And so it's how do we move people towards these like context-rich, reputation cost messaging spaces, which I believe for like reasons we can talk about in a second will become almost a necessity in the not too distant future due to foundation models and large language models.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if we can take this and all just play it forward. Like, how is common knowledge going to change in the next 10 years? For me, that means how are virtual reality spaces, metaverse spaces going to change it? How is AI going to change how we create common knowledge? And then distributed ledgers. I mean, those are the three technologies that I'm aware of as trends, but there's probably other social movements and things that we could reverse engineer out. But anyway, I'll just restate my question, which is how is the evolution of common knowledge on the internet going to change over the next 10 years, and how weird is it going to get?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily have an answer, but I have a sketch for what I think it could look like. And I think let's just look at some of these different tools separately, and then we can see how they intersect. So with foundation models, the way I see it is currently you have these tools that are sampling from an unlabeled data set. An unlabeled data set that represents currently some distribution of human language, right? And it's not super polluted with what AIs are outputting. It's actually sampled on, right now at least, quite representative of like natural language of humans as it has been evolved to the digital spaces. And so like the way we communicate online is a good representation of that data set. What happens is like over time, the data sets that we're training these models on starts to become polluted with the outputs of the models themselves. And so the distribution of natural language actually shifts to no longer be representative of the human natural language outputs, but rather the natural language distribution of like ChatGPT outputs as an example. And so what happens there is that you now have a set of outputs that are going to be dictated by the common knowledge of this new data set, basically. And so the real concern there is that our natural language itself will be subject to change, and what will become common knowledge will be subject to change due to these foundation models. However, like what shows great promise is that we're now seeing a real impetus to use cryptographic signatures, digital signatures, or these various different techniques to really preserve privacy and preserve the authenticity of information and identity. And so I guess as an example, right now in the Web3 communities, there's this concept of don't trust, just verify. And this comes from the early Bitcoin community in particular, but has now like really, I think you can agree, Kevin, is at least a mindset that a lot in the Web3 community adopt, and the blockchain there being an instrument to allow people to verify instead of just trust. This mindset, I think, is something that we will start to see the mainstream start to adopt due to these foundation models. Like what's going to happen in a not too distant future is all the information that you see, you won't know whether it's human generated or basically a generative model outputting that information. And our initial mechanisms for identifying what is real and what is not becomes into question much, much more. And so like this becomes a much harder problem for identity verification now, because no longer is a blue check mark sufficient for me to know whether or not that account is real, because the ability to falsify information becomes so much more real. And you have very persuasive accounts being generated that look very, very real, but are actually very fake. And so because we can no longer do identity verification, and we can walk through that as well, like when we think about how we verify identity, whether it's proof of human or like biometrics, and the various different ways in which we do this, like Sybil resistance attacks degrade, then our ability to create common knowledge degrades. And so we need a new suite of tools to be able to first of all verify identities and then verify information. And once we can do those two things, then we can be able to potentially come back to thinking about common knowledge. But until we get there, common knowledge is almost unachievable without new ways in which we can protect information and communication flows in the era of these foundation models.
Boy, I mean, it's quite scary when you look at how deep the rabbit hole is created by AI. But I know before this we were chatting about this tweet from Balaji about the authenticity industry. So basically, the need for anti-fraud and proof of human and detecting deepfakes and banning bots, like whatever the evolution of computer captchas and Turing tests are, like there's going to be a whole industry around creating this authenticity, and that's going to enable us to have better coordination if the technology develops to do it. So, I mean, what does the authenticity industry look like to you? Like, what is the counter reaction to these trends?
I think it's maybe the most exciting thing we could see, because I think it's possible that, as for reasons we talked about earlier, like the internet may have been the most damaging thing to human communication we've ever seen. Not in terms of like connecting people around the world so they can talk to their loved ones, but like from a very root level, like human communication has been degraded as a result of the internet because of our inability to preserve context and common knowledge. And we've done nothing about that for the past 2 decades. It's possible that this threat from foundation models and the pollution that we're about to see on our information spaces could be the precise attack we need to be able to start adopting these privacy preserving technologies that many in the Web3 and cryptography communities have long talked about and the benefits of. And so, like an example, today we have the CAPTCHA, no CAPTCHA, or reCAPTCHA, which are basically automated public Turing tests, right? Like that's what they stand for, like completely automated public Turing tests to be able to determine what is a human and what is not. CAPTCHAs are going to disintegrate by the end of 2023, potentially, or like, I don't want to put a time frame to that, but CAPTCHAs are no longer going to be sufficient to doing proof of human. Our ability to look at government credentials from a photo may no longer be sufficient. And we may have to do digital signature checks and see, like, is this signature from some public table of public addresses from the government of the United States or the government of Canada or whatever other governments are part of this, so that we can actually verify the authenticity of that information. Like multi-factor authentication, biometrics, all of these are subject to attack in a very real way. That's going to make identity verification quite hard. But I think there's a lot of very promising work going on that makes this all very exciting, because if we can solve these problems, and because people will almost become forced to start adopting these privacy preserving techniques, we have real hope of actually achieving and preserving common knowledge and context collapse with these new technologies, because we'll no longer be able to use these broad-based, information sharing mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely some amazing cryptographic techniques and technology that's being built here. The thing that sort of worries me is how to actually get it adopted. And there's the whole saying that the truth can go a rumor can go a mile before the truth gets off the finish or gets off the starting line. And I think that we see that a lot with rumors spreading on social media. Social media is great because it allows us to connect peer to peer, and we don't have to worry about we don't only have to get our information from news, which is highly centralized and hierarchical. Newspapers, same problem. But, there's this problem of viral misinformation on social media. And I feel like the internet kind of got ahead of itself, where it allowed us to communicate with each other, pass information across each other, but it didn't allow us to trust each other at scale. And it feels like for me, Web3 and the deployment of cryptographic techniques is like a second wave, or I guess it's a third wave if it's Web3, of our ability to verify information. But I just worry that the average person won't understand enough cryptography or how to use products that use cryptography, or just won't care because they're so busy trying to verify their confirmation bias that those tools won't make much of a difference. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I think that if one person was to say like, yeah, I think like cryptography tools today are incredibly difficult to use, including crypto wallets as being the entry point for Web3, they're still quite challenging to use. I think it becomes a inflection point in the way we think about how people interact to communicate. Like maybe email was hard too to use when it first came out. Maybe like all these different tools are incredibly challenging to use. And I know this is kind of the standard argument for like anything new is going to be difficult from a UI UX perspective. But I think when it becomes almost a necessity to use, we will find a way to make it really easy to do. And I guess as an analogy, I think we do communicate in a way that cryptography models mimic in the physical world, that I think where people are going to start to see these parallels. And so as an example, me and you might have a conversation at a coffee shop with one another, and me and you having that conversation in real life, assuming there's nothing being recorded, there's no technology there, we have what's called the deniable conversation. Like you can go and tell someone else what we talked about, but they won't believe you unless you can like provably show I said something. And so like that's going to become a really popular way of talking in the digital world, because in order to share information outside of a given group, everyone else is going to assume it's fake, just given the amount of polluted information that's going to exist. So with any given claim you make, there's going to be an n number of artificial claims supported by that as well. And so because of that, everyone's going to be operating in this very low trust and verify environment instead of this trusting environment. And so what happens though is like as me and you are having these conversations in our coffee shop and we feel more confident about sharing that information to more public forums, we find the right ways to basically like federate that data up to more open formats, whether it be through conferences, whether it be through digital formats or other. And I think that this analogy in the physical world is drawn by the intimacy gradient. And so when you enter a home, you can walk into a home and you have a very clear sense of like the public versus private spaces by the architecture design. And so typically a home transcends from being like very public to being very private, from the main open areas, the kitchen, through to the master bedroom and the master bedroom's bathroom. And these public cues that exist in the physical world allow us to know like how we communicate and affects the way we communicate in a privacy preserving way. And I think we just don't have those norms yet in the digital world of like what's a private space beyond DMs and basically open. And so I think we're going to get much more, like a lot more design exploration there with like what is these privacy norms and where are these spaces going to exist. And it's something that's going to take a long time for people to get used to. And that UI UX challenge is going to be a real one. But I think that as it becomes a necessity, I'm quite confident in the builders and designers of this world that like we will get to that space that will allow us to communicate again.
That's great. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work that you've been working on with Glenn on Plural Publics, which I think is about how we can achieve common knowledge and context collapse. I feel like you're kind of you're teasing it a little bit here, but let's get into it. What's Plural Publics?
So yes, it's a name that we're teasing around with different people. It is like Plural Publics is a word that I'm hoping other people will start to like understand its very rich meaning, but by definition is just digital communication flows or channels that are able to preserve context of information that's being shared. So that's it. Like as long as we can preserve context in a communication channel, then we call that space a plural publics. And I'm using publics in its plural form, like unusually here, but I'm doing so like very intentionally, as it stems from this idea from John Dewey, who maybe many of the GreenPilled listeners may or may not know, but is a social thinker who talked a lot about this idea of emergent publics. And emergent publics being these spaces that recognize the very complex and interweaving nature of the way that humans communicate with one another, who come to form opinions and ideas around shared issues, causes, and interest. And so we called these digital spaces plural publics as such, and we can walk through like what these plural publics are, how they are good design, and how we envision building them as well. So the way you can imagine plural publics is, first we have to make some like assumptions. Like one is like these things that I'm commenting about foundation models and AI is going to be a reality that exists. Now that assumption is not too aggressive an assumption to make. Like I think it is very real to say that these information networks are going to be polluted and people are going to be looking for places to communicate in a way that they can have trust and they can verify information. And so if you were to like imagine social networks today in a very like graphical structure, as if anyone here is familiar with like how social networks analysis is heavily graphical in nature. Like when you study social theory, social networks, it's typically represented in a graph-like structure. You can imagine that
so let me just interject for the listener. By graph, you don't mean like a chart that you put in Google Sheets. You're talking about like the graph where like you and I are both nodes and there's an edge between us because we're friends, or I follow you, and then you have your other edges out there. So like you're talking about a node edge sort of graph, right?
Precisely, yeah. And so I want you to imagine now that each node here in this graph is a given publics. Again, using it in its plural form intentionally. And this publics can be anything that you define it to be. It can be me and you. It can be the Green Pill, podcast community. It can be Gitcoin. It can be a basketball team. It can be a group of friends, whatever it is. The key part of this publics is that no matter what happens, we preserve a boundary on that information being shared. Meaning, if you try to go and share something we talk about, no one else is going to believe that we even talked about that. And so this is what's called deniable messaging. So we get a communication platform that has deniable messaging amongst the participants in this group. And so why is that important? Well, it's important because if you cannot share information outside of the group, then the information is preserves its context only to the set of participants that are inside of this group. And so I want you to imagine that we now have this group of people who we've agreed upon to be part of this like space. And so anything we communicate in this space is only able to be verified by the group of people in this space. So if I try to share it with someone else, I could, but they may not believe me. And the reasons why they won't believe me is through a various different suite of cryptographic primitives, which are called designated verifier signatures and zero knowledge proofs, which maybe for the purposes of the podcast, I don't know if we want to go into those. But broadly, they are cryptographic techniques that allow us to preserve this form of deniable messaging in a zero knowledge fashion. And so by doing so, we basically get these social graphs that cannot spill information outside of their intended creation place. And now what we get is let's say me and you do want to share something with another group. So me and you are having this podcast, we come up with a great idea and we want to go propose it to the Gitcoin DAO. Well, I can't just go share it. I need both of us to have consensus as to how we're going to share that information to another publics. And so we have these different governance models for how we share information. And if we choose to share this information, we then again use this primitive of a designated verifier signature to share it with the broader Gitcoin DAO, and only they will be convinced that that information originated from both of us. And
so it feels So it feels like this is a tool for managing context collapse because Precisely. You need consent to take something outside of your own public and into another public that you're in.
Precisely. And there's a lot of this is the general feel of how this works. And we think that this is going to become a framework, not necessarily this framework in itself, but frameworks like these are going to become the frameworks for how humans will communicate as we start polluting our information structures. And epistemic security, which is the word that's used for knowledge infrastructure, epistemic security is at risk. And so it's our ability to preserve context that allows us to now have the appropriate set of people be convinced by information, because right now our information graphs are very subject to this leaky form of information sharing.
Yeah, and I feel like that there's this quote from Sam Harris that I love, which is nuance is the enemy of common understanding. So the more nuanced a take gets, the harder it is for people to understand. And I think that that's probably because of context collapse. When you're broadcasting to many publics, all of which who have different understanding knowledges, maybe even different languages, then you have to go for the least nuanced take if you want to hit the broadest possible engagement. And so if we were to be able to divide up our publics and only broadcast to people who we understood which common knowledge they have, then it moves you away from this sort of thing where nuance is the enemy of common understanding and you can't actually have meaningful conversations because of that context collapse. That feels like a pretty key problem to have solved. Although, the other side of me is venture and startups is all about networks and going as broad and blitzscaling as much as possible. And so actually recognizing these plural publics and allowing us to be able to engage with them separately sort of goes against the VC accelerationist hyper so I guess I'm just wondering, what will be the first killer app of plural publics and how do we support it now that we have the common knowledge that common knowledge is important and context collapse prevents that. Like, it almost feels like we're going against the VC model by trying to build something in that way.
I really do want to push to try to get into this mindset of like where these foundation models and AI is going to be, to a point where that VC model no longer exists. Like, you will no longer believe what a given VC or networking claim online says if we don't start to move towards techniques that I can even verify that this is the given venture capitalist that I'm supposed to be talking to. The ability to basically falsify or forge data as it relates to identity data is going to move to such a low cost to where deception becomes almost free, right? And so like, it's under these conditions where I think that these VC models are going to need to adapt towards ones where I need to start communicating and networking and sharing information in a fashion where at least the recipients of this information can verify that it's in fact me. And the ways in which I do that may not be exactly like the ways we do, let's say, deniable messaging, but it may involve some form of digital signature where people can in fact verify that that claim is tied to my identity. But what is my identity? Is it like a public address? Like shreyjain.eth is my public address, or maybe other people have their own public addresses that have a suite of interactions that may make it credible-ish to assume that that person is in fact the person that they're claiming to be. But it's not too hard for someone to make like a Shrey Ja or whatever .eth as well, to have an also very persuasive set of interactions on these given, DAOs or proposal making or whatever transactions I may need to make with a given foundation model. And so it's under these conditions where it becomes maybe even digital signatures are no longer sufficient. And so I think it's under those scenarios where I think these types of communication flows, like Plural Publics tried to propose, are going to become much more necessary. And the ways in which we're going about that may differ, whether it's just like a typical digital signature, deniable digital signatures, and the primitives we use, whether it's like NFTs, verifiable credentials, or even just basic JSON like web tokens.
Yeah, it's sort of quite interesting to play this all forward and to think about how these things interact. I'm wondering how you think social media would be different at this point. I mean, social media, there's a lot of sort of conniption here in 2023 about Twitter and Lens Protocol and Farcaster and all these other sort of models for social media. Is there any sort of trends in social media that you think are promising towards creating this future that you and Glenn Weil are envisioning?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to like out here like promoting different social platforms, but I think like as an example, I just like have so many of these different tools I've been trying on my phone. So like on the top here, I have Mastodon, Farcaster, I have Signal, I even tried like some of these apps that I don't actually use, but I wanted to get an understanding of how people on them operate, like True Social, and even like trying to better understand how insular groups communicate, and like better understanding how the communication mediums that they use are. And so what's interesting to me is like a reflection I've had is on Farcaster, at least, Dan Romero has done a very good job, I think, of having this like context rich space where there's a certain type of way of communicating on Farcaster, and like by definition is able to mitigate the types of people that are coming onto the platform, because in order to be on the platform today, at least, you have to get a DM from Dan Romero. Mastodon, like very similar. The one I'm part of is Cryptodon by like Phil Diane's the manager of that, server, at least. And I think there's like, again, a necessity to move towards these like smaller circles and basically fork off of like a baseline protocol and allow a set of people to communicate in these smaller circles is a model that I think we will start to see more of in this like very broad-based information sharing that Instagram and like mainstream Twitter have today will start to decay in interest, not because of anything else other than the ways in which we interact with information will become unusable and like basically unverifiable, and therefore operating in this very low trust fashion. And so I think the only ways in which people will start to use social media is if they can have this ability to verify and authenticate information, which to me feels like is only possible in these like context rich spaces. Because as an example, like even me and you talking today, I could be very much so empowered by an AI system right now in our conversation, which is fine. But what matters is that like like that AI should not deter the social norms of how me and you communicate. Like this I myself may even be like an AI right now in a podcast with you in a forward version of your podcast recordings. So long as like that version of Shrey doesn't deter the social norms, maybe that is a version of AI that like we're actually okay with. But it's the minute that that starts to stray away from the norms of these communication channels that it becomes quite dangerous actually. And so as an example, it's like, how do we distinguish between an AI and a not AI? The outputs, like if you've used the OpenAI has this API, it's called like text classifier, and you basically can put in outputs from a AI model into their classifier, and it will give you a probability of AI or not. And it performs horrendously. I've given it like direct outputs from ChatGPT of like write an essay, write a story, or even the Da Vinci models or other large language models, and it can't determine what is an AI or not, even from its own systems. But what I think is very easy for humans to do, at least, is like if you start using regen or words that have a lot of context between me and you in a way that it strays away from the norms that we've established, I can very quickly identify that you're probably not Kevin and you're probably someone else. And maybe you're not an AI, but yeah. So that's kind of why I see this, like the tendency to more context-rich spaces being almost inevitable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it'd certainly be a more enjoyable conversation to be able to know the common knowledge of the circle that I'm in. And I think that that can sort of amplify itself, the like having the more common knowledge within these circles, and we can move away from this nuance being the enemy of common understanding. And I think this is a foundational part of coordinating and creating public goods funding in these ecosystems. So that's pretty exciting to me as well.
Yeah, no, precisely. And I think it's like that exact point where I think the Web3 community at least is a really great place to start experimenting with these tools, because I think we see a lot of the experimentation with the social platforms, at least with Lens, Farcaster, and other, where maybe there's like a real impetus now to go and try different things. Like let's try to attack this network with, foundation models and see how people's, intuitions of what is real or what is fake changes. And then how can we create tooling in a Plural Publics or other type of framework to combat that, and then have that framework be one that others could benefit from as well.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about how these plural publics relate to each other? Because one of the things I'm sort of wondering is, if we're all a part of a dozen plural publics, in what way are those plural publics, do they have overlap with each other? And in what ways are they sort of at war with each other? Because I think that there's sort of a lot of different thinking about this, depending on who you talk to and how you envision the future. Whether we always have the right to exit and defect out of these plural publics, and we're creating these smaller and smaller containers that don't have any interop with each other, or if we're building this coordination across social distance where the plural publics are more cohesive with each other. I guess it's a long way of asking what polarization looks like with many plural publics.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Like I guess to be quite frank, is like this will also support very insular communities to become much stronger at doing the actions that they may want to take. So if you're like a very if you're like a radical group, for example, like this type of communication would help you coordinate on the outcomes that you're interested in coordinating on. Like that is just an outcome of improved coordination that has this like context rich space that may be unmoderated and allows people to participate in. So that's like a very bad outcome of this. There is a lot of overlap though between the ways in which I as a user may participate in Plural Publics as like a social platform, because I am participating in a conversation with you, and that in itself may be its own publics. I'm also part of a basketball team. I'm also part of and other communities of which I might be a subset. Like me being part of a basketball team might make me also part of this like basketball following group, and like whatever that may be. What's important is that I can always trace the provenance of information back from where it at least started. And so like this question of that you're asking of like right to exit versus like incentivizing voice, the framework there is a bit different in that like we're not trying to say that we're trying to have people ask a question of whether or not they want the right to exit from a community, or we want to rather incentivize voice. It's rather much more like root level communication of like, if you choose to communicate, you communicate under these conditions in a way that, yes, you can obviously leave, but there's also ways in which your voice is more heard as well. in a way that, but I guess, sorry, to be clear, if you do leave, the information doesn't come with you because it's required that there's some governance mechanism, whether it's majority vote, quadratic voting, whatever voting you want to say, for that information to leave the group. The group needs consensus. And that also has a limitation to people who are oppressed by the group, because people who are oppressed by the group may not be able to take that information with them. But there's mechanisms in place here to like allow that to happen under a certain set of conditions. And like, this is where the governance question comes into play with communication flows as well, which is another big value out of the Web3 community, and one that me and you have been talking about, at least in other ways.
Yeah. I want to take a minute to sort of unfurl a theory that I have about public goods funding, and then I'd love to just kind of riff on it with you.
Yeah.
I know we only have 8 minutes booked. I can go a few minutes over though. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I can go as well.
Okay, cool. My next meeting just got canceled, which is great because I want to riff on this with you. Okay, so I'm gonna give this talk at ETH Denver, basically laying out this vision. But I have this sort of holonic view of how public goods could be funded in the future. A holon is just basically a group that is also a part of other groups, and so in that sense, it's like. I'm a holon because I'm a group of my own cells. You're a holon. Together, us doing this podcast is a holon because we're a group of two people. The Ethereum community is a holon. Microsoft is a holon. Gitcoin is a holon. And so basically any group of individuals that is a part of another group is a holon. And like up and down that stack is called a holarchy. It's basically groups on groups on groups on groups. And basically, one of the things that started to develop in my mind, it's actually kind of funny to try to describe this on audio because it's a very visual sort of vision, is a holonic view of funding public goods. So basically, like in the Ethereum community, the Ethereum Foundation ecosystem support program has traditionally been the main public goods funder in the Ethereum community. And then Gitcoin and quadratic funding was sort of like another way of sourcing funds and then distributing funds inside of that holon, the Ethereum community. So you basically need a funding sourcing mechanism, and then you need a distribution mechanism to figure out what the most important public goods in that ecosystem are. And you can stack multiple funding sourcing mechanisms and distribution mechanisms on top of each other. And so just to continue the Ethereum ecosystem example, it's like the ESP, which stands for Ecosystem Support Program, and then Gitcoin grants, and now there's retroactive public goods funding and DAO drops and CLR fund and Giveth. So you've got these like pluralistic funding mechanisms in these ecosystems, and so now you've got basically like these funding mechanisms that can be applied to any holon, and you can take these funding mechanisms that worked in Ethereum and do them in your own DAO or do them in your own community. And so like as many holons as exist that you can find funding for and you can do distribution for, you're able to go up and down the stack of like not only Web3 technologies and their DAOs, but also Web2 communities, and then eventually like city-state public goods, all using the same forkable open source code. And the elegant thing about this is like, what is a ecosystem development program in the early parts of the ecosystem is the same as a public goods funding mechanism. That like quadratic funding is an ecosystem development tool for you when you're first building your ecosystem, but it's a way of rewarding the people who are providing those like public goods as it matures. And so that actually provides like a capitalist incentive to build this model of public goods funding mechanisms. And so I guess that was like 90 seconds, and maybe I'm belaboring the point, but basically this holonic view of how we fund public goods to me fits very elegantly with what you're talking about with plural publics. For you, what you're calling a plural public, I'm calling a holon, but a world in which we each have highly nuanced views of what's going on within our holon or our plural public, we're going to have better funding distribution mechanisms within that holon. And so I guess, putting that all out there, I guess I'm wondering if we riff a little bit on how common knowledge in these holon/plural publics helps create public goods funding and what the implications are for public goods funding in both of these views, which I find to be very compatible with each other. So I know that was a lot, but what's your reaction?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the holon concept, I've just put it up on my screen here. It's very interesting. I always do love these mathematical or philosophical analogies that people can grapple on. And I do like this holon concept here. The intersection I see here being like very concrete is, in order to be able to know how to fund public goods or what mechanisms make the most sense for a given Publics or holon, it requires the contextual understanding of the people composed of that holon. And it also requires a very strong communication framework between those people to be able to come to consensus and coordinate on that given mechanism appropriately. And so I think like the way I see this intersecting is like the way I see Plural Publics intersecting with, I think, many different areas of whether it be like funding, communication, coordination, is that it improves communication outcomes in general, like potentially a lot. We haven't proved that. It's purely by instinct and like assumptions and taking a lot of the social theory to underpin it. But it if we can communicate better, and we can communicate better in a way that allows stronger coordination outcomes, then that means coordinating what mechanisms we use for what given holon is also going to be determined much faster in a way that we can maybe experiment much quicker. So like in this world that you're picturing, right? It's this world where we have this like ability to really plug and play with different mechanisms to a given context. And like that's fine. And like when you think about it today, like we also have a lot of different mechanisms that we could adopt for voting to very rigid systems like the United States government or any like nation state government. But it's like the inability to coordinate effectively in a very context-rich space that makes it very challenging. So imagine now that you have like improved coordination outcomes, and then you can like actually take this like tool set that you've built and actually start to like play with it because you have the improved coordination and contextual cues necessary to be able to do so.
Yeah. So it feels like we have higher context and we're not suffering for context collapse. So not only the selection of the mechanism, but the implementation of the mechanism will be much higher context, and therefore we get a higher resolution view of what public goods people actually care about, because we have common knowledge, is kind of how I piece it together.
Precisely.
Yeah. Well, I am sort of curious to see, like, you know, right now I think the public goods funding is a meme in Web3, and it's, you know, it's honestly thanks to Vitalik caring about it that I think it's become a sort of hot thing to talk about. But I'm really curious to see if and when the tools that are prototyped in Web3 can be exported to the rest of digital technology. And, you know, the two examples that I'll give there are basically like Web2 open source packages, anything in the pip or npm ecosystems, and then but also companies that are more Web2. A company in a way is like a holon that is more gated than a digital ecosystem like a Web3 open source ecosystem. And so in what ways could we create more democratic engagement of employees of companies, of like these tech companies, by using public goods funding mechanisms that are pioneered in Web3? But then it also gets really cool from a civic engagement perspective, is taking things like quadratic funding or in retroactive public goods funding and using them in local city states. I mean, this is called participatory budgeting in local city states. And so, you know, in what ways can we combine funding mechanisms, distribution mechanisms, and common knowledge creation mechanisms in these different types of holons in order to fund public goods? And, you know, as of course, this is a podcast about regenerative crypto economics, so it's all about revitalizing communities and creating more democracy. And like, you know, to me, what's really cool is that we're sort of investing in common knowledge and common code bases in order to figure this all out. And the momentum is only going to compound as more and more people join this movement. So yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, and I think like one other, like, to add on to that is, I think that there's these different camps of thought in the crypto and AI ecosystems in particular, which is like crypto argument against AI is like singularity is bad, therefore like decentralization is like a very good thing we should strive for. And it's like maybe singularity here, or like the attack of such types of systems, will actually be the catalyst to like allow for decentralization as it relates to our communication and coordination flows. And like I can see that having a very direct impact to cryptography. And then when it comes to these like regenerative mechanisms, maybe as we start to transform the set of tools that we've been so used to, as we're starting to see search starting to change, which has been the same for the past 20 years, but maybe search is going to transform due to these foundation models. Maybe some of the other set of tool stacks that we're very like comfortable with using are now going to be subject to change due to the very real, impact that these technologies are going to have. And so I'm also hopeful that not just cryptography from like a digital signatures perspective, but also these like regen mechanisms in the Web3 community will also be of more interest to start adopting in the Web2 spaces.
Yeah, amen. Well, I want to ask you a couple of closing questions. I know that we're going over here, so I'll move towards wrapping up. But when we were talking about this episode, we talked about the title for the episode, and one of the ones that we considered was "Common Knowledge is a Foundation of Love." And I'm wondering if we can unpack that, because I don't think that we've actually gone there yet in this conversation.
Well, I mean, to give context to the listeners, I don't know if this part's releases, at least is like, today's Valentine's Day, and so I think that's part of the reason why we had common knowledge as a foundation of love. But I think there's like a real truth to that, which is like, when I think about maybe not love explicitly, but I think a lot of the beauty, at least, of communicating with people who you're close with and the interactions you have with one another, there's a much richer feeling in that communication with those people around you than there is with some arbitrary person in the public. And it's like, when you have context with someone, there's a much more there's a feeling that comes with that, right? And so I think that common knowledge plays a big role in allowing us to have a strong understanding of these contextual cues. And so I think that's part of the play here. Like, common knowledge is a foundation of love.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think about the people that I love. My wife, my kids, my community, both the Boulder community, but also the online community. And that common knowledge is sort of a byproduct of spending time together, and that common understanding. It's possible to go a little bit too like cerebral on this and just say, like, obviously common knowledge correlates with love, and I can just experience that empirically. But it's kind of interesting to hear two very cerebral nerds on a podcast try to come up with a priori reasons why common knowledge is a foundation of love.
No, I love it.
Yeah. Well, that might be a good place to end, but I just wanted to give you the space in case there's anything I didn't ask that you want to tell us. Is there anything I didn't ask about common knowledge that you want to say, or Plural Publics that you want to say?
No, I think that we had a very good discussion. I think I'm excited, but also a bit scared, obviously, of the impacts of the ways we communicate are going to happen, or that's going to happen over the next couple of years. But I'm also very hopeful to work with people, both listeners of GreenPilled and others, to start working towards building these plural publics in a way that we can actually combat these epistemic threats in the very near future.
Yeah, the only way to go is forward, and that's why I keep leaning into building these technologies, into building this movement. So it's horrifying, but what's the quote from Game of Thrones? You're in the great game now, and the great game is terrifying. I feel that every day in the Web3 space. There's only one way to go, and that's forward. Yeah,
exactly. And this existentialism is like both scary, but also very helpful for moving the space forward as well.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this podcast has created a little bit of a pocket of common knowledge, and there will be common knowledge about why common knowledge is important. And there's a certain meta loop of that that's exciting for me. And Shrey, I just want to thank you for coming on the pod and enlightening us. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm most reachable on Twitter, Shrey Jain ETH on Twitter. And then you can also email me at shreyjaineth@gmail.com. Either of those work. And feel free to DM me anytime.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Shrey. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.